grandfather deaf. Go back to California, 1800s, before New Zealand. New Zealand. So I have hearing Jewish and deaf Jewish. So you talking hearing Jewish in general.
Yes, I'm doing the background first, and then I'm going to be moving on to, it's just to give you a bigger picture of what was happening in Ireland. But if you were to talk about Jewish deaf in isolation, the way that I normally operate is that I give you the big picture, background information first, and then zoom in on to the smaller details.
Thank you.
So I'm now going to show you something just to give you further. So this is the Jewish population in Ireland from 1871, there was 258. In 1881, there was 453, mostly from England or Germany. In 1901, it increased to 3,771, mostly from Eastern Europe, particularly Lithuania, and of which 2,200 were living in Dublin. And then in 1904, approximately 4,800 people resided here. Thank you for your patience. When we look at the wording Russian Jewish, we do have to remember one thing. The Russians at that time were different to what they are today. So when we talk about Russian Jew, we're talking about Imperial Russia. And we know that it's Lithuania, Latvia, Bulgaria, you know, we're looking at those countries, but we now know that those have now since split. So with all of the problems that were happening, as I mentioned, they would have moved to the US, the UK, and South Africa. Now, a huge percentage of the Jews in British that came from Eastern Europe, they had planned to move to the US, but found themselves on a boat where, you know, where they were given money to pay for a ticket, so they were dropped off in Ireland against their own wishes, so ended up staying. So that would have been the situation that would have been for them back in the day. Now, before I spoke about the census, are there any questions based on what I've just said? No? Okay. Now, another spreadsheet that I'm going to show you. Has everybody read this okay? Are we done? Okay. Now, I'm sure you've noted very, very small numbers of deaf. Now, the census form would have listed different categories, be they deaf, meaning that they can speak, but they simply did not hear. If they were a sign language user, they were deaf and dumb. That was the language at that time, back in 1911. That wouldn't be done today. And also dumb only. So you can see there was 3 separate categories. And also what was interesting, there's a question from Omar, Zach. Now he has asked a question in chat. So looking at 1901 and 1911, are they an accurate description of disability back in the day? Because there has been more precise studies done of the census Now, do you know Oscar Wilde? His father focused a lot on census work, and he was the census commissioner. So what he did in 1851, 1861, and 1871 did very detailed breakdowns of statistics in relation to deaf people, deaf sign language users, and dumb people. And that was because he was in the ear, nose, and throat surgeon. So that's why. So those statistics are available, but looking at 1901 and 1911, 50 years after. So you've seen the breakdown. You had the high numbers of 3,000, 4,000, and then you're looking at a bare handful, 3, 4. And why is that? What's the story behind that? So let me tell you. So what it is that I'm presenting to you, you can take it to be right, and then we're going to have a discussion. It could be a case that based on differing perspectives that you present, my information may not be right. Now, there is a census online for 1911 and 1901 and 1911, and I can give you the link to that. And I've also had a conversation with Stuart regarding this as well. So this is the deaf Jewish population, if you just bear with me. So look at what it is that I'm doing. And here we have 1. So that would be a deaf sign language user, 1. And it was Lithuania. But at that time, it would have said Russia, but it was actually Lithuania. EH. So to ask you, so you got a deaf sign language user from Russia, but it was actually Lithuania. The other was EH, 13-year-old girl from Germany. cannot read or write, quote unquote, dumb. So the question I have is, was that girl just a case of not knowing English? She was sent to a workhouse, and the workhouse at that time meant it's a place where people had no job, whereas now we have a pension that we get benefits from the government, you know, different types of support systems. But back in the day, you didn't. So you went to a workhouse equivalent to the Oliver Twist concept, that kind of thing. Now, I have searched for deaf, hard of hearing, cannot hear but speak, zero. Zero, none. So the next thing, have a look. And it's an Irish Jewish family. The next I'm going to show. And this one now, I think the name is Marison. Lena, and the mother of the deaf boy was Edward. And when I researched this, I found that Lena and Harry Levy, do you remember the Deaf Sign Language boy back in 1901? Both of them were brother and sister. And the deaf boy here is the nephew of a deaf person in 1901. So that's that bit. The next family is Purcell, P-U-R-C-E-L-L, that had moved around England, South Africa, Ireland, back to England, back to South Africa. How do you pronounce it? Mirilson? So if you have a look, you have David, Max, now looking at this family, both David and Max moved to South Africa and lived there. That is the coda. There are codas there. The girl in the middle, Fanny, she went to school with two others, but if you just bear with me. Exactly that. So Gloria is right about the reading or the writing of Yiddish. So bearing in mind that they're at the workhouse and there are so many people, I don't think they had the time to interview everybody. So if they didn't speak English, they probably had this look on their face, so they would have been presumed dumb. That's my thinking on it. Obviously wrong, but we cannot assume but we can only imagine or extrapolate what we can. So looking at the breakdown of statistics of 1901 and 1911, just hang on there seconds. Looking at the statistics and the equivalent, so looking at the general population and the numbers of people and the numbers of death is equivalent to the Jewish population. So we are looking at similar percentages. In 1901, there should be 150 Jewish that could be hearing in Ireland. But based on the census, it says 2. One was a sign language user and the other one was dumb. But we don't know if they could speak another language. So there's a question mark there. In 1911, there should be around 190 Jewish, definitely deaf, but it states only 9, of which 6 were sign language users and the other 3 were dumb. So they could have come from other countries, so it could have been a language issue here. But the other thing, looking at the 18-year-old and less, so where were the over 18s? Where were they? Someone saying 2 more? Maggie, you talked about there should be 190 deaf, hard of hearing. Like, how would you know it's a should be statistic? The World Health Organization statistics, that's where it comes from. Now remember, hang on. The World Health Organization statistics, it is a guide. It's not exact. It is a guide. Now we know that you can play around with statistics, so take it on that basis. The information that I received was from the census. So I'm giving you the general population, the Jewish population and the Jewish deaf population. So breaking it down. So who they were deaf, it didn't matter where they were from or who they were. Now feel free to do your own census research and then compare it with mine. But I honestly did my best with the research that I did. Now we're looking at 8 possible factors here. And this is the fun part. Feel free to interrupt, whatever. Now I cannot see everyone. If it's a case that you do want to speak, please do your question in the chat facility so that everybody can see. In Ireland in 1901 and 1911, there was a growing Jewish population. There was also a growing deaf population. The Jewish community obviously are not deaf, and the deaf community are not all Jewish. But looking at the Jewish deaf community, now there were in other countries, but not in Ireland at that time, up until now. So the better quality of life for Jewish deaf community was obviously in other countries, not here. That feeling of being Jewish deaf was going to be in other countries. Now, when you ask most people about Ireland, most people think of Ireland as people that leave Ireland. You don't go to Ireland because Ireland is a poor country, agricultural. So there's better opportunities in other countries, different job opportunities. It's like, bye-bye Ireland, I'm off. Human nature, isn't it? Even Ireland would leave. Looking at arranged marriages. At that time, Irish society, similar to the Jewish community at that time, I don't know about now, but you would have a matchmaker where they look at one person and saying, okay, I think you could marry that other person. But there wasn't enough Jewish deaf population here, so the family would look for a suitable match to arrange a marriage, but they would look to other countries. So that is a factor that I had thought of. Another factor, I am looking at my other information. Now you've got the information in the PDF and there's recording. So what I'm saying here is in the PDF. There was one example of a deaf man by the name of Emmanuel Goodman. He went to school for the deaf in, where was it? His parents had organized an apprenticeship. Thank you for that. So Emmanuel worked as a printer in England, then moved, well, obviously he moved to England. So where did I get that information from? Was from a deaf woman by the name of Rachel Pollard, and she wrote a book called The Avenue and spoke about Emmanuel and the family, for example, Pescash, I think, where there was important celebrations. You would have to have special permission to join the family to have the celebration, you know, the different festivities as part of the Jewish faith. And there's good information in the Avenue about that. The fourth is about work opportunities in other countries. The next thing is educational options. At that time, there were three: the Catholic school for the deaf, the Protestant school for the deaf, or an immersed Jewish school. So those were the three. But they could have been sent to a deaf school in England or other countries. For example, the Purcell family, Max and David, were sent to school in England, in Manchester. But we need to find out for certain if it was a deaf school or not. So more research needs to be done on that particular point. It's also possible that the Jewish deaf, looking at the quality of life in Ireland, would have gone to Rochester in America or England or South Africa that I've already mentioned. I've already mentioned David and Max Purcell got married and had children in South Africa. So obviously the quality of life was better in other countries than here. And like I said earlier, people left Ireland rather than go to Ireland. The number one factor, deaf sign language users were not noted in the census. For example, Fanny Purcell was not noted as being deaf or deaf and dumb or dumb, but went to the same school as her brother. That requires more research. And it makes sense. You know, 5,000 Jewish population, of which there were only 6 that were noted. It doesn't make sense, does it? So there has to be more. For those that are Jewish that had moved to Ireland from Eastern Europe, the Irish Jewish family were fine because they could speak English. But for those that came from Eastern Europe, either speaking Yiddish or the language of the country, they may know English or they may not. But if they knew English, that's fine. But if they did not, then the census enumerator, the person that completes the form, possibly would have spoken to them and received no reply, tried to get a name, tried to do some pointing, or could have guessed they may be deaf and just push it down. Now, in the census, we had illnesses. And there was a point that was raised yesterday. The form had the list illnesses. Maybe people said, but my child is not ill, but may not have perceived deafness or being dumb has an illness. So there are 8 different factors that I have outlined. Now, there's a question from Omar. So if Jewish deaf were not in the census, what about the Christian deaf? There is. And this is the thing about statistics. We cannot say that is it. It's all about the interpretation of factors. We are dependent on people completing the form correctly. Looking at Christian deaf, yes, there is a similar percentage. Now, I don't know about back then. Was there a stigma attached to being deaf? I don't know. Okay, so I'm now going to open it to discussion because my presentation is finished. So over to you. Maggie? Looking at the read or can't read or write, how was that information? So the person that would have been responsible for completing the form would have knocked at the door, would have gone from door to door. If they had said, can't fill it, they would have had a conversation. So the person who was knocking on the door had the responsibility to complete the form if they could not read or write. At the same time, if a person could not read or could not speak English, it would be that person completing the form that made an interpretation of that person at that door. Anybody else? So it's just really interesting.
I have a question. In the early 1900s,
Sorry. So there's two people.
Andrea, hold. Maggie's asking a question in Irish Sign Language.
okay,
Sorry,
I didn't see her.
I've completely missed the question. Andrea?
Yes,
Yeah, go on.
somebody else was asking a question. Just tell me when to talk.
Yeah. Right, okay, Maggie's question was, if a person did not read or write, how did they complete the form? So that was the question asked there. So my answer was, the enumerator who would hand out the form would be responsible for completing the form based on a discussion. But if the person, if the person was speaking, if it was a Yiddish speaking Jew, they would have an interpreter. Andrea?
Must have been a coda. Question, back in the early 1900s, with such a small Jewish population, are there traces of a synagogue being built?
Yes. There was a synagogue established in the 17th century, in 1660s, and the
Wow.
first synagogue that was built. Hang on.
Is it still in use today?
No, it is not. There is now a separate synagogue in South Dublin. Now, one thing that I did forget to mention, my apologies. Looking at the attitude of people in Ireland towards Jewish at that time is important. In 1904, in the early part of 1904, in Limerick, so looking at where is Limerick, so this is my map of Ireland on my hand.
Okay.
So north, south, east, and west. So Dublin is to the east. So you go down towards the southwest is where you will find Limerick. There was a Jewish wedding. People were having a great time. And an article was printed about it. And one Catholic priest for the Cree did a mass sermon ridiculing the Jewish. 35 Jewish families were living in Limerick, equivalent to 150. And they had a Jewish sector. So for the Cree said, Limerick pogrom, which is offensive because nobody was killed. So he was trying to incite it. So 200 people threw stones and mud at those people. And there were injuries, no one killed, but this took place in Limerick. And the Jewish community either moved to Cork, so they would have gone to the next county down to Cork, or would have moved to England or America because of it. So they also boycotted Jewish businesses, and the Irish politicians said it was unacceptable, and For the Cree was punished.
Oh,
And
good for,
what they did with the Catholic Church, you know, that were priests that were troublesome, they would have been moved elsewhere. So that's what happened to For the Cree. He was moved elsewhere, but the damage was done. The Jewish population did not feel comfortable in Limerick.
I wouldn't.
But one brave man in 1978
Oh.
had said, I'm going to get a train ticket, sat on the train, and said to the Limerick people, I am Jewish. What are you going to do? And the Limerick said, you're welcome. Come on in. So this is based on what he had heard. There's not a love or hate relationship here, but there's always anti-Semitism that happens somewhere.
Yes.
We also have, we had a Jewish mayor. We also had a Jewish TD, a member of parliament. So we did have them in our population. But there was a dynamic that happened at that time. It was troublesome in some parts of Ireland, where not in other parts of Ireland.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, there's a couple of messages that have turned up, so I'm going to give her a couple of minutes just to read them.
Thank you, Catherine.
You're so welcome. Well,
Catherine, she's reading the question of the signs of the mikveh, which is the ritual bath.
oh, thank you.
It's in the chat. That's where she is right now.
Okay, I've completely lost where I am now. Can you see what she's saying?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm back. I completely missed that, but I'm hoping that the rest of you got it. Now, the attitude during the Second World War. In the links that I have given you, there is information on that, but I can't give you any more information than what I've already given you.
Yeah, but I don't have phone. After 3 million years. Here you go.
Sheila Jacobs, you're next.
So I'm curious now, is there Jewish deaf and children quotas in Ireland
You're welcome.
now? Yeah.
The deaf community, there is one Jewish deaf man. His mother was Jewish, and his religion has passed on through his mother's side, but is not in Ireland anymore, has moved to America. So as of now, 0 Jewish in our deaf community in Ireland. And we need to collate this kind of information so that as and when we have Jewish deaf researchers coming to Ireland, we have information here already for that person. Maggie? Well, that was going to be the same question. Is there any Jewish deaf population in Ireland? Now, when I worked for a TV program, we did try to interview mainstream Jewish deaf, but did not want to be interviewed, which is fine. But there are people out there in the mainstream, but in our deaf community, zero.
So
Sheila?
know that when you ask for ideas for new topics, I explained to Catherine my family history. Jewish to New Zealand, and I know New Zealand seemed connected to England, Ireland, right? So then you Jewish press excited to watch, and I want to tell you, because first time deaf history Jewish background. So thank you. First time I'm old, 60, 62. And still I not know many my Jewish, because hearing Jewish, then deaf-born me hearings, don't know hearing story. So thank you for start more. Thank
You're welcome.
you.
Okay, anybody else? Are we drawing this to a close now? Okay, well, if that's the case, then all I can say is thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, George. Thank you.